Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar, Future-Proofing Our Past, How Can We Make Our Historic Building More Sustainable? The British Property Federation works closely with its members, industry stakeholders and government to promote and facilitate sustainability in the built environment. The decarbonisation of historic building represents one of many work streams currently being delivered by the BPF and its members. I'm Marianne Bailey, partner at PDP London Architects, expert in reinventing London's built heritage into a responsible and relevant one for future generation. I sit on the Passive House Trust Board and I'm the author of a book, Residential Retrofit, 20 Case Studies. And I am working with LETI, London Energy Transition Initiatives, on a retrofit guide. Without further ado, I will introduce the extraordinary panel that we have this morning. Our first speaker will be Duncan McCallum. Duncan is Historic England Strategy and Listing Director. He has responsibility for strategy and policy issues and also national listing issues across the organisation. Particular priorities for the organisation at the moment include climate change, energy saving, and planning reform alongside contested heritage and various current topics. We will then hear from Victoria Herring. Victoria is Director of the Sustainability Programme at Grosvenor Estates, providing support and challenge to the business, ensuring their ambitious environmental strategy is converted into action. Jane Henshaw from Cadugan Estate. Jane is a project director at Cadugan with responsibility for all of Cadugan's development projects. Then we'll hear from Laura Jokers from Howard de Walden Estate. Laura is head of sustainability and is responsible for the strategic integration of sustainability and corporate responsibility across the organization's building and services, operation and culture, and philanthropy. So I would just like to clarify that during the presentation, I would like to encourage you to submit your questions and comments through the Zoom Q&A function that you will find at the bottom of your screen, as we shall turn to them later in the webinar. I will now hand over to Duncan, who will take you through the Historic England's perspective on what might entail to future-proof our past. Duncan, over to you.
Thank you very much. So many thanks to the British Property Federation for partnering with Historic England. The issue is a very high priority for both organisations. The UK has declared a climate emergency, and that demands a new approach to managing change in the historic environment. As the government's advisor on the historic environment, Historic England knows better than anyone that nothing stands still, and we are all about managing appropriate change in the historic environment. We know there is an urgent need to address climate change challenges, cutting the root causes of climate change coming from within buildings, and making sure too that the buildings stay usable as climate changes kick in. We showed in Heritage Accounts 2019 that it is possible to reduce carbon emissions from historic buildings by over 60% through appropriate refurbishment, retrofit, and better management. As you would expect, we take the long view. 21% of houses date from before 1919, as do 48% of retail business, 33% of offices, and 17% of industrial properties. So in global terms, England's built environment is older than average. Around 2% of the total building stock is protected by national listing. And even after locally listed buildings and those in conservation areas are taken into account, the vast majority of older buildings are not formally protected. However, we think that they have proved their worth, they've survived and been adapted over the centuries because they are flexible and very often energy efficient in construction and with thoughtful and sensitive interventions in their operation. The tricks our forebears used to make those buildings comfortable, like door curtains and awnings and so on, are just as useful now. However, the way we use buildings changes, as do our expectations and our understandings of the impact of our resource and energy usage. That's why when it comes to adapting structures for energy efficiency, Historic England is strongly of the whole building school of thought. If you are thinking of making changes, it's essential to understand the historic significance of the building as a whole and of all the various elements. And if you want to make a historic building as usable as possible and cut down on energy and carbon, then you really want to understand how it was originally designed and designed to function. Carl Elefante, former president of the American Institute of Architects, wisely said, "The greenest building is one that already exists." If you take the whole life carbon approach, a typical historic building that's sympathetically refurbished and retrofitted will be emitting less carbon by 2015 than a new building built using modern systems. Taking a low carbon approach is essential, but that doesn't mean just the carbon used from this point forward. We also need to include the embodied carbon of the building elements. So, for example, thinking of a secondary glazing rather than just replacing a repairable original historic window and replacing that with double glazing. On top of good historic good practice, there are some really welcome new technologies we can use. But before we start adding elements that may or may not be good for the building or its occupant, we need to make sure that we understand the underlying building performance issues first. We need to look at the evidence of how different approaches to retrofitting work in the real world. Whatever we do needs to work in the long term. In planning and in the planning and heritage context, the NPPF is obviously central in setting policy. An authentic historic building means retaining original, historically significant elements of a building so far as is possible. So what is Historic England doing right now to improve the current situation? Well, we're collaborating with government departments to help ensure that there's a balanced policy position that addresses climate change and energy saving challenges without compromising the historic environment. We're working hard to ensure consistency in the way we respond to the many listed building consent cases we're consulted upon. We're busy undertaking supporting research that tries to fill in the gaps in our understanding. We're always looking to improve the clarity and accessibility of our guidance. We're also keen to increase the training we offer, and not just to heritage professionals. We recognise that we need to work more closely with a wide range of partners to seek greater consensus. We've increased the number of staff working on this particular issue, and with all of that in mind, we're currently developing Historic England's climate change strategy. One of the things about heritage protection in the UK that is widely admired internationally is the positive way heritage is seen by the general public. And surveys of owners of listed buildings suggest that they generally buy into the balance that's currently struck between protection and change. The last thing Historic England wants is for owners and investors to move away from putting their money into old buildings because they see them as being rigidly protected from reasonable and necessary adaptation. I think the current policy interfaces between heritage and energy efficiencies could be made clearer. So we welcome Grosvenor's initiative and those of other companies and organisations who are trying to find practical and long-lasting solutions to these issues that work in business terms and work in heritage terms too. So finally, Historic England needs to explore how to encourage efficient retrofitting that takes full advantage of our historic building stock, but taking proper account of significance. We are confident that there is much less conflict than is often presumed between conserving history and conserving the earth. But it is only by working together that we will get the balance right. Right for our heritage, right for the planet, and right for the people who own, live and use our buildings. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan, for your detailed and insightful perspective about Historic England's work. I will absolutely concur that we are stronger together, and the old barriers to those conserving history and conserving the earth are really vastly diminishing or no longer. As per your introduction, I just want to say a couple of words that we are obviously facing a serious climate emergency and must gather our effort and transform our words into immediate actions. Amongst the climate change implication on our industry, the challenges faced by historic building is probably one of the most difficult to resolve. However, the industry has prepared for this during the last 10 years. The number of exemplar projects are flourishing around the country, such as Enefit project, which delivered comprehensive whole house approach and achieve 80% space heat demand reduction, which are the key characteristic of good retrofits, all of which we can learn, get inspired, and be motivated by. Historic England, as you've clearly detailed, are mobilized and working to publish further guidance. Other organizations such as the Sustainable Traditional Building Alliance are also publishing some critical good guidance. LETI, which I've mentioned, are about to release, who have released their climate emergency design guide for new build, is also about to publish a retrofit guide in the spring. We must springboard from those exemplar and guidance documents to make the British built heritage part of a responsible future, not just a thing of the past. I'm delighted to have on the panel some of the early pioneers who have already tried and tested retrofits, reuse and repurposing within their world-renowned building stock. And so I will now hand over to Victoria Herring, who will take us through the Grosvenor Estate strategy vision. Victoria.
Great, thank you, Marion. So this morning I'm going to share with you how here at Grosvenor we've approached retrofitting our historic estate. So our estate in Mayfair and Belgravia has over 2,500 units, of which 95% are in a conservation area. And we've got 500 grade 1 and 2 listed buildings or structures. And due to our ownership, we've got varying levels of control and influence on our assets, which makes this rather a complex task. But since 2013, we have been busy retrofitting more than 450 units in over 100 buildings on our London estate, prioritising properties and families that are in most need of improved energy efficiency. We've already spent over 25 million and reduced carbon by around 25% since the original 2013 baseline. Those completed heritage retrofits include some high performers. We've got properties that are in a conservation area that have achieved NFIT Passive House certification. And we have units in listed buildings with A-rated EPCs. And we even have a listed residential property which achieved BREEAM Outstanding. We launched our Think Zero document in December, and this sets out how we're going to achieve net zero by 2030 and our key milestones along the way. So essentially, to achieve net zero, we'll be improving the energy efficiency of our existing property portfolio, minimising the carbon emissions from our developments, and collaborating with our occupiers and suppliers to reduce their emissions. We aim to generate renewable energy on site where we can, and then offset any remaining emissions, which will result in net zero. So around a third of our emissions come from our existing heritage buildings, and we have two key areas of focus for those assets. Firstly, we're committed to the delivery of a £90 million retrofit programme. And secondly, we'll be engaging with our occupiers on how they can effectively and efficiently use our buildings. So together, these two areas, we hope to achieve a 70% emission reduction over a 10-year period. To date, we've predominantly tracked our success, like many others have, using just theoretical energy performance, such as from EPCs. But we plan to shift away from this to tracking actual whole building operational performance using things like meter readings, display energy certificates, and the new Neighbours UK energy ratings. And because industry frameworks are still emerging, we've developed a provisional set of energy use intensity targets to keep us on track. We're going to use these targets and keep them under review. So as our evidence base improves with the rollout of our smart meters, and from us putting in place green leases that require occupiers to share their data with us. So it's particularly challenging to retrofit historic properties as there's no one size fits all solution. So to reflect this, we've budgeted an additional £300 per metre squared above existing maintenance and refurbishment costs, the level of which reflects obviously our central London location. We'll also be replacing our largest gas boilers by 2030, which represent over 70% of our annual gas consumption. Finally, I think one important activity that's often overlooked in retrofit programs has been our focus on changing the culture of our business to embed sustainability and promote innovation. We recently appointed an executive director of sustainability and innovation to ensure that sustainability remains at the heart of key decisions making for the business. And our board also has a strong focus on environmental issues under our current chairman. We also deliberately have a small sustainability team to ensure that responsibility for making us a more sustainable business remains devolved and everyone takes responsibility. And so far it seems to have had a good start. In our latest staff survey, the number of staff feeling empowered to deliver our environment goals was at 86%. So that brings me to the end of what I was going to show you today. But if you want to know more about our net zero approach, then our full pathway is at grosvenor.com/think0. Thank you, Marion.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for taking us through Grosvenor's net zero carbon vision. I would urge all the attendees to have a look at Think Zero, the Grosvenor pathway to net zero by 2030, which is an incredibly transparent and accountable plan. And I hear Grosvenor are welcoming comments on their plan, so do interact with Grosvenor and Victoria. I will now hand over to Jane Henshaw, who will take us through the Cadugan Estate's experience. Jane, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. That's great. And good morning, everybody. Lovely to not quite see you all, but know you're all there. That's great. And thank you very much indeed to the BPF and to Historic England for this opportunity. And Gail, if I may have the first slide, please. So the Cadugan Estate is 93 acres. It's based in Chelsea and Knightsbridge. It's mixed use and we manage it for the long term. It's been part of the fabric of Chelsea for 300 years and it offers schools, churches, shops, offices, homes, an amazing art gallery, a wonderful theatre, great concert hall, lots of gorgeous restaurants, hotels, and also, very importantly, gardens. It's very characterful and it's a London neighbourhood. And because of our long-term interest in the estate, we're stewards of the area and we make decisions about developments reflecting a number of different aspects, not only financial returns, but also social, economic and political issues as well. And the discussions that we have are challenging and rightly so, because the implications of any new scheme, whether new build or retrofit or refurbishments, are long lasting and conclusions are usually very, very finely balanced. And when we consider where we are now and where we'd like Chelsea to be in the future, our strategy is informed by three aspects. And they're on the right of this particular slide, showing environment, community and heritage and conservation. And there on the left, you've got a map showing the 93 acres in Chelsea, which stretches from Sloane Square northwards towards Knightsbridge and west towards King's Road. And our vision for the future is bold and incorporates a net zero target for 2030. And it's led by our sustainability manager, Kate Neal. Our vision's been developed with contributions from all parts of our business, including our asset management team, our lettings team, our gardens team, property management, as well as from the local community, our residents, our tenants, and those who we work with, including RBKC and wider community groups. And so as we look to the future, we need to balance three aspects. First of all, comfort, to provide places where people, family, businesses, visitors feel really comfortable to be within and want to return to and remain within. Heritage, to maintain and enhance the wonderful Pont Street Dutch architecture, which is a feature of the estate. And then also to reflect energy consumption and the move away from fossil fuels, which is so key to where we are now. Next slide, please. So I've now got three slides which talk about projects and how we combine those three issues within our projects. So the first one of these shows Pavilion Road. Only as short a time ago as 2015, this was a cut through for getting up Sloane Street quickly in your cars. But it's now become a beautiful village heart of Chelsea. They're various shops, generally smaller businesses, and we've really carefully selected our suppliers. And they include a butcher, a fish, a cheesemonger, amongst coffee shops and wine bars. And this provides a mix for local people to shop, all within walking distances of the offices and flats and houses. And so therefore this lowers energy consumption in itself. It's pedestrianised, so it contributes to air quality. And in the recent past, it's been a real lifeline for local residents. It's a really, really nice place. And I'd encourage you to come and have coffee here when we all can. The next house property I'd like to talk to you about is the Passive House, which is on the right-hand side. This is also on the Pavilion Road and is part of the Handstown Conservation Area. The external detailing was really carefully considered because it's so important that our properties contribute to the overall look and feel of the street and where we live. The internal features include triple glazing and also a plant room to accommodate the kit that recirculates the air. It's quite a big plant room, I have to say. And our tenants really love living there, and they have very low utility bills, which they're pleased about. Now, I've mentioned Pont Street Dutch architecture, and you can see two examples of that there. 57 Sloane Gardens, which is in the Sloane Square Conservation Area, and also Cadugan Hotel. We refurbished 57 Sloane Gardens in 2018 and reinstated much of the period detailing internally. And externally, we made sure that the brickwork, the roofs, the chimneys were repaired in a way which reflected their age and heritage, but weren't looking shiny and bold and brand new once the scaffolding was dismantled. Cadugan Hotel was a facade retention project and incorporated 5 townhouses into a single property, and it provides everything that a modern day traveller would wish for. We used artisan contractors to restore and replicate much of the original detailing, including beautiful oak stairs that extend up all the way through the building, really amazing. Beautiful floor tiles in the entrance halls and public spaces, and incredible stained glass windows. And this is a great place to have a glass of champagne when all of the COVID stuff has ended. Could I have the next slide, please, Gail? Lovely. And then finally, talk about Cadugan Hall and Sarchie Gallery under community spaces and diversity and inclusivity. Now, both Cadugan Hall and the Sarchie Gallery are Grade 2 listed buildings. Both have been retrofitted and both repurposed, and we're really delighted to have worked with PDP on these projects. And these are 2 buildings where it's a really good example of where retrofitting has worked so well because the new uses fit in so well with their original uses. Cadugan Hall was previously a place of worship. It's now a concert hall and hosts performances such as Jeff Goldblum, Royal Philharmonic, and also the Gruffalo. And then the Sarchie Gallery was a regimental headquarters, and it's now home to leading modern art, including a superb exhibition from the Rolling Stones in 2016, an oil slick in 2010, and then not at all modern, very, very ancient Tutankhamun in 2019. There's an amazing running track outside, which also hosts a market, and that provides spaces for local schools to use. And again, is part of our green offering, our green infrastructure. And there you can see some yoga being practiced, and also our socially distanced circles that we had in the summer. So the next challenge emerging from where we are is how we can make best use of our assets into the future, and of course emerge out of this current crisis and take advantage of the opportunities offered by our vision for 2030. Thank you very much, Marion.
Thank you very much, Jane. It's really comprehensive insight into Cadogan experience and a great engagement track record as well. So thank you very much for this. I will now hand over to Laura Jokers, who will take us through their own feedback on how to make a difference and embrace positively the energy efficiency challenge ahead within Howard de Walden. Laura, over to you.
Thanks very much, Marion. Thanks for inviting me onto the panel. It's a pleasure to speak and be involved in this debate. It's important to us. Heritage is really at the heart of our estate. Gail, if you could just move to the next slide. Thank you. For those of you who aren't familiar with Howard de Walden, we're very fortunate in that we have a real rich array and diversity of heritage buildings. We're long-term stewards of those buildings, encompassing 92 acres of Marylebone. The entirety of the estate falls within either the Harley Street conservation area and the remainder, just a small amount, in the Portland Estate conservation area. So entirely within a conservation area. We have, similarly to some of the other panelists, we have over 200 listed buildings. As long-term stewards of the estate, we constantly seek to retain the beauty of these period features while also repurposing and reinventing them for the requirements of the 21st century. And of course, that includes improving energy efficiency and playing our part in decarbonising our economy. We're increasingly facing pressure to bring these beautiful heritage buildings up to increasingly high energy efficiency standards. And as you can imagine, as some of the other panelists have alluded to, that can be very challenging. Gail, if you could just go on to the next slide. Just to sum up some of the challenges we face, similar to the other panelists, as I say, but when you look at what's permissible within conservation areas and on listing buildings, some of the options that are available on newer builds or buildings with less historic character are not options for many of the buildings on our estate. Simple things like double glazed windows are often challenging for us. Basic things like external wall insulation, floor insulation, very difficult when you're trying to retain the historic character of a building. Even practical constraints like new technologies such as air source heat pumps and the sort of degree of servicing required by some of those technology means that often dropping ceilings is required, which then sort of can be challenging in terms of retaining the original features. So lots of challenges, and of course, as Victoria mentioned, the additional cost of budget. I think she mentioned a price of £300 per square foot. It does increasingly make some of these developments challenging from a financial viability perspective. Having said all that, putting all those challenges aside, we are finding opportunity to work really well with the local authority and making what seems impossible possible in some cases. And one of those, if you'd like to move to the next slide, Gail, is 34 Weymouth Street. So this, as you can see, it's a grade 2 listed building. It's in the heart of our estate. It's rich with sort of Queen Anne style architecture, shaped gables, mullioned and transom lead windows, and a wealth of beautiful features both inside and out. So we're currently rejuvenating this property with three goals really. The first and foremost is to retain and restore its historic features, period features. The second is to raise the energy efficiency and reduce carbon emissions. And the third is to improve the living experience and the comfort for future customers. So they were sort of the three goals we set out to achieve on this particular project. Gail, if you could just flip to the next slide, please. As part of the project, we've identified a number of strategies that we can implement without impacting the historic fabric and features of this building. These include new insulation on the basement slab floor, roof insulation, a new roof and indeed insulation and insulation to external walls, new doors and windows. We're keeping the front door entrance as part of our grade listing and heritage responsibilities, and the windows we were hoping for a vacuum glazing. We've actually settled on a single glazing replacing the single glazed windows with secondary glazing, which does impact the final EPC rating slightly, but not as much as perhaps we might have expected originally. So in some senses, that's quite a good compromise. And because we've been able to make the other gains in terms of the insulation on the thermal elements, it still stands up as quite a desirable outcome from an energy perspective too. We have replaced the sort of gas boilers with now an air source heat pump for hot water heating and mechanical ventilation from heat recovery. We're installing LED lighting throughout, low energy appliances, smart meters and controls, and green roof. Unfortunately, the size and the shading on this particular roof did not allow for PV panels, but one of the other things we're looking at in this project, as I said, was the comfort of tenants. These beautiful windows are south facing, and this particular building was at high risk of overheating in the summer months, and the green roof is one of the measures we've taken to try and ameliorate that, as well as a tenant handbook with advice around curtains and shading in summer months. And of course, we've got the energy efficient ventilation system through the air source heat mechanism. So that's just a snapshot of some of the things that we've been able to introduce and are introducing in this live scheme, which we're hoping to complete in the third quarter of this year. Gail, if you could just flip to the next slide, please. Thank you. So at the outset of this project, we commissioned a carbon and energy assessment to identify all the possible measures that could be taken on this particular building, following the hierarchy set out in the London plan, which is lean, so sort of making energy efficiencies, avoiding waste, then moving on to sort of clean options like district heat networks where possible, and then finally green low carbon technologies such as the air source heat pump that we've arrived at. And then we then did a comparison between what the existing building and its services and thermal elements, or the carbon emission that existing baseline is, compared to the green route that we have gone down, which is the air source heating and hot water and air conditioning system, along with improvements to the thermal elements through insulation. And on the next slide, you can see that we're hoping upon completion to arrive at somewhere in the range of between 75 and I think it's 92% reduction in carbon emissions. And we've been able to upgrade the EPC from an E, hopefully to a C. And those things were not without challenges. Things like dropping ceilings to just fit some of this new kit into some of these spaces has been really challenging. But we've only dropped ceilings in sort of common areas and bathrooms. So being able to retain almost all the original features and restore, in many cases, features that were, in need of some restoration work, like the windows were damaged. So in all, it's been a really good outcome. But as I say, not without its challenges, and also for us, this is not an opportunity that arises every day. It's perhaps once every couple of years. And so then we need to look at, as a responsible landlord, we need to look at the everyday actions that we can take that don't impact the historic sort of attributes of the building, that don't necessarily need permission from the local authority, that are low cost and quick to implement and turn around. And on the next slide, I've just sort of highlighted some of those things, and that these little measures, little decisions that happen every day do add up. Things like replacing conventional lights with LEDs, additional insulation on pipework and ductwork, draft proofing doors and windows, repairing and using originals, shutters where possible, or or other sort of curtains to prevent drafts, selecting energy and water efficient fittings and appliances, putting more controls and sensors particularly in common parts, the rollout of smart meters, and where we have responsibility for procuring the energy, we're switching to green suppliers and REGO-backed suppliers. So, all this does add up. But I suppose the question I'm leaving the panel and everyone out there is this enough given the scale and pace needed to avert the climate crisis? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for this very comprehensive and pragmatic illustration of how you have, addressed energy efficiency aspects and how you're aiming to reduce your carbon emission and the complexity that comes along with it. So thank you very much for that. Before I take questions from the floor, so to speak, I'd like to ask a couple of quick questions to the panel, which are recurrent in this retrofit topic, and I would like ironed out. They are also referred within some of the Q&As that are coming through. So thank you for posting your questions. So Laura, first, a key question which comes up very often is, should listed buildings be spared from retrofits given their unique importance and given they represent a relatively small portion of the building stock?
Thanks, Marion. Well, obviously, as we've explained, for us, it's not a small proportion of our stock. We want to play our parts and our role in, as I said, decarbonising our built environment and our economy at large. The Westminster Council has set a climate emergency, and a recent study suggested that I think it's in our local area, in most local authorities, buildings contribute to around 40% of carbon emissions. But for London, many parts of London and Westminster, it's more like 80%. So when you look at those sort of local contexts, actually it's not an option if we do want to hit those targets, but it's perhaps not an option. It's not a decision that we as landlords can make. It's perhaps one for the policymakers and perhaps more research into it. It's, as Duncan alluded to at the beginning, if you take the operational energy alone, then yes, some of these buildings may appear poorly performing, but actually when you take embodied carbon and the cost of demolition and rebuilding, holistically, they're inherently carbon efficient. And things like EPCs don't acknowledge those elements. But also EPCs don't acknowledge what's permissible and not at a planning level either. So it's not really it's not something I believe we should be given a free ride on, because as we've all demonstrated in these presentations and talks, there's so much we can do even with this historic stock. It's just at the moment we could actually do more if there was some flexibility in the planning, but that's not really for us to make those decisions on. We're looking for guidance on that, I think would be the answer.
Okay, thank you very much for broadening the topic to engagement with the local authority and the topic of also consistency of policies, I suppose, and appropriateness, I suppose. Another question for Jane. Can you let us know a little bit more your foresight for the estate?
Thank you, Marion. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Foresight for the next 10 years is relatively easily mapped out. And as I say, we've got this vision for Chelsea 2030. But then looking to the longer term, how are we going to be around for the next 300 years? It's a family business with Cadugan, and we're led by the family, and also the property and how the two come together. So it's firstly sort of big picture planning. A lot of it is around our leases and making sure that the leases all come together for site assembly at the same time. We want to be inclusive and work with our community and work with our local stakeholders, our residents associations, with our BKC. It's not always particularly plain sailing. Unfortunately, we do end up with spot listing on buildings we've got big plans for, and that derails things whilst we get ourselves back on track with things. So it brings its challenges. It needs to bring social benefits and economic benefits. As I've mentioned, you know, the appraisals need to stack up. It's not always from a financial perspective, and it might be over a much longer term than some other developers. And I think also, you know, looking to our past for informing our future, and something we've looked at very recently is what previous generations have done when struck with situations that we've got now with the pandemic. And looking at the 1920s, we were really heartened to see that they are actually called the Roaring Twenties. And we are so looking forward to emerging out of where we are now and perhaps having the Roaring Twenties in this century, just as we did do in the last.
Thank you very much, Jane. Yes, it's an all encompassing, quite complex approach that we need to have, and a visionary one. One for Victoria. What do you think Historic England or the government should be doing to support sustainable retrofit in historic building? In particular, I think your Think Zero guidance are referring to the notion of a public benefit for energy retrofit, for energy efficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, firstly, in terms of Historic England, I think Duncan already at the beginning of the panel discussion talked about what Historic England will be doing. And obviously we're hugely supportive of that. And we're actually already talking with Historic England to help take things forward. One thing he mentioned, which I think is important, is the need to improve the guidance and make it much easier to access, potentially more visual and definitive, so that building owners can make informed choices, and so decision making can become much more consistent. In terms of government policy, I think starting with a positive, the intent of the recent white paper is obviously very welcome, in that it does talk about creating a system that can both protect and intelligently adapt historic buildings in the context of this climate emergency. But policy guidance and regulations are still incoherent and inconsistently applied, which essentially on the ground leads to really complex planning negotiations and processes expensive and time consuming and confusing, even for specialists. So I think the government should introduce changes to relevant legislation which will make it clear that carbon reduction and energy efficiency objectives apply to the whole of the built environment, including heritage buildings. And the new national planning policy framework should also include specific policies for carbon reduction in relation to all existing buildings, again, including heritage assets. But I'm not implying that carbon should outrank heritage. We just need to put them on an even keel. So both need to be seen as public benefits.
Okay. Thank you very much. I absolutely concur with this view. So thank you very much for this. I'm going to take a few questions. We still have time for a few questions from the floor. So I've selected one that is again for you, Victoria, just a very quick one, I hope. Somebody is asking that you are mentioning that you will be replacing your boilers, but with what?
That's a good question. We'll be replacing them with renewable, cleaner energy, probably air source heat pumps, but each individual installation we'll be looking at, and we are actually trying to explore new technologies as they come out. And there are issues with air source heat pumps, which again, we're trying to get the lessons learned from where we have installed them and make sure we replace them with the right things.
Okay, thank you very much. I will take another question here, which I think is very interesting, which is about, which is from Helen Evans. The question to the panel members are, how can we take a strategic approach to policies around sustainable retrofits when there is so much variety and differing specific technical requirements within our existing built heritage? So perhaps Laura, you might want to pick that one up. I think it's a bit about, you know, the metrics what are the right metrics to use to cope with the variety of the heritage that we are having to retrofit?
Yeah, well, that's something we're looking at the moment. I'm sorry, the sound broke out a little bit, so I don't think I've fully heard the question. But so could you just clarify?
How can we take a strategic approach to policies around sustainable retrofit when there is so much variety in differing specific technical requirements within our existing built heritage?
Yeah, well, that's something we're struggling with internally, and it's a fairly recent appointment. I joined the estate in September, so I think that's a reflection on the challenge of the size of that challenge in itself. We're currently working with the project managers to try and come up with the sort of development guidelines where which draw on industry best practice and our knowledge of what works in our state to try and come up with, a set of minimum requirements, depending on, for even the light touch refreshes, right up to more sort of extensive requirements for those larger builds. But we have such a vast variety of different buildings, different types of projects, from residential to medical, and retail. It's an exercise and undertaking in itself.
I would just like to springboard from this question to another one, which is very much related, it's about EPCs and whether or not EPCs is the right metric.
Yeah, well, we all know the challenges around EPCs. We've struggled even in our sort of light refreshes where we've replace gas-fired boilers with electrics, and it's not been reflected in the EPC result. And as you know, there's a consultation out now in terms of raising the EPCs for residential. We all know the flaws, but I don't think the industry can absorb another standard. I think there's generally consensus around they are moving at least people's thinking and practices in the right direction, even if the methodologies underpinning them are, challenged and not always reflective of the outcome of certain projects or measures taken. But yeah, I don't think many of us, and perhaps it's one to ask the rest of the panel, I don't think anybody wants to see another measurement system come in, and therefore we need to work with what we've got and continue to improve them.
Okay, sorry, Victoria, would you like to?
Yeah, just want to add to that, I thought the Passive House Trust actually did a really, which I thought were really useful review on the EPCs as efficiency targets, and looking at the issues and maybe recommending a way forward to not completely throw out, as Laura says, the EPCs, but maybe combining with space heating targets to have a more informed approach. So I think that's quite a useful document.
Great, thank you very much. I should stress that there's at least half a dozen questions about EPCs in the Q&A, so this is definitely a hot topic of the moment in historic buildings as well. Jane, one for you. There is a question about how do you assess and justify the sometimes higher cost of investment of these energy efficient measures, or do you just consider that they are a must do?
It's a careful balancing act, and our appraisals, I mean, we're very, very fortunate because we're here for the longer term. We haven't got those very, very short term objectives, which some can sometimes just lead to financially led decisions. So that we've got a range of different factors coming in to make a balance. So we have to be quite brave in the decisions we make sometimes and recognise they've got longer payback periods. We try to create the best infrastructure for making those really well informed decisions, and so we understand and we have studies done on the economic contributions that each of our areas make on the estate, such as King's Road and Sloane Street and Sloane Square and the different units. So we've got data that we can rely on, but yeah, it's not always easy balancing the short-term drive for financial effectiveness with the longer term issues around being on the estate and making sure that we contribute to the heritage.
Thank you, Jane. Duncan, one for you here. I've got a question about working together to provide the industry with the right tools, and a comment, I think, from the STBA to work more hand in hand and develop some surveying tools that are collaborative and leading to useful guidance for people to use and achieve these retrofits.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really exactly the game that we're in at the moment. We recognise, and many of the panelists have talked about the need for consistency and trying to help people make good decisions. So a lot of that is working with other partners who have expertise and from different perspectives. And I think trying to distill that into guidance, either we can get government, if possible, government to state these things. If that's the case, that's the strongest way of ensuring consistency. But also where that's not possible, then we can provide guidance. And at the end of the day, it's up to local planning authorities to make decisions, but we can try and guide people as far as possible, give them good advice based on solid evidence, because I think part of these arguments at the moment are based on partial evidence and not understanding the full picture. So I think this is very much why we're so keen to work with other people, the STBA and others, to try and create a kind of consensus. And also, there are occasions, of course, where listed building considerations do come into conflict with energy saving ones, and it's very hard to reconcile that. But I think most of the time it can be reconciled at the moment. There is additional cost. There are things like VAT that might be able to be looked at, specifically in relation to energy saving work to listed buildings. That's the kind of thing where alternative ways of thinking through the problems might help to make them more applicable in a wider range of situations.
Thank you very much, Duncan, for this. I've got another very topical question, which I was hoping somebody would ask, and somebody called Suzanne has, which is one for you again, Duncan. Several panelists have mentioned triple glazing, for example, the passive house in the Pavilion Road scheme, and my own retrofit passive house project. Triple glazing can be provided in sliding sash as well as casement windows format in timber with high level of history authenticity. There's a big gap between standard and Historic England's position on preferring secondary glazing. This advice appears to be being misapplied in Westminster, where planners appears to be universally applying this to all buildings in conservation area, whether the windows are of historic or architectural interest or not. Can Duncan comment on this, please?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the individual case because I don't know about it, but I think over the years, English Heritage and then Historic England has written quite a lot of advice on windows, and it's all on our website. I think we're continuing, we recognise in a sense that I think one of the questions earlier on was, what's the biggest challenge? Numerically, the biggest challenge we have to deal with is windows in terms of the kind of issues that keep on coming up. And the difficult, the reality is there is no one size fits all solution. So these things can work in many cases, but in some situations they won't. So there's been comment from various organisations that our guidance could be clearer on these sorts of things. We as a government agency are not able to definitively say what it does and is or is not acceptable in listed building consent terms. That's the local authority decision. But I think we go as far as we can, and we're looking at our guidance to see if we can make that clearer. And then also we're keen to roll out more training to local planning authorities and others to try and gain greater consensus, understanding and appreciation of how it can be achieved in a reasonable way. And we're also always keen to hear of examples, good and bad, that happen, because we need that evidence to help fine-tune our guidance, and also feedback to government as well to say these are the particular challenges we're facing at the moment, and see the extent to which they're able to firm up policy positions, and how far they're comfortable in us going in being definitive about certain technical solutions being acceptable or not acceptable.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I hope this discussion with government will conclude rapidly to be able to make a difference. Another question, perhaps one for Victoria, which is about considering a carbon reduction goes beyond improving the building. Are any of the sustainability plans, including reduction on energy use, tenant consumption, and how are you tackling influencing tenants and that are probably not concerned about energy costs and consumption efficiency? So I suppose it relates to your, obviously, to relationship with all your tenants.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important area, and we've you know, almost half probably the energy demand is from how the tenants use the building. So it's a massive area for us that we're trying to slowly unpick, and we've started by introducing green leases into all our new leases, allowing that conversation to happen, and we're planning to set up sustainability forums so that we can start talking to occupiers and tenants and sharing ideas. So I guess we're sort of at the beginning, but we've recognized the significance that the occupiers use play on the buildings, and we need to work with them to work out how the best way we can influence them.
Thank you.
So we're working with people like the Better Buildings Partnership. They have a new working group which is about landlords and occupiers together, and I think that's very important.
To join the dots, yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you very much. I would like to ask another question, which has come up, which is a very, very important one for retrofit approaches in historic building, which is one of modeling of condensation risks. I often say a retrofit is exactly the same as a new build low energy strategy with the added complexity of moisture, intelligence and understanding. So the question from somebody called Michael is about whether or not there is enough understanding and I guess modeling of the implication of retrofitting. So is anyone, perhaps Laura, you might want to comment on how you're approaching the assessment of the impact of the measures that you're retrofitting in your historic buildings?
Yeah, I mean, obviously condensation is key feature when looking at retrofitting old buildings, or key thing that needs to be considered. And I think it does link to some of the challenges around, you know, the windows. I hate to harp on about the windows, but I think more does need to be understood around, you know, what the ideal solution is. We've, I think I mentioned in my presentation, we've put in proposals that, you know, in terms of visual impact, or look almost identical to the originals that, you know, then don't require secondary glazing. They're vacuum glazing or very slimline double glazing at passive house standards. And, you know, just from a window perspective, they avoid moisture issues of, you know, things like secondary glazing. So, and then of course you've got things like airflow and ballooning of chimneys and ensuring, you know, adequate airflow when you're putting in new insulation and features. So probably I'll be honest, it's not an area that I have a great deal of expertise in, but it's something I know that our engineers and surveyors look at in great detail on every scheme.
Thank you very much,
and
Laura.
It's challenging.
We have actually monitored the fabric of our buildings where we've done retrofit, and we've demonstrated that we haven't had condensation between the fabric, but that's where we've had really tight control over the installation. So I'm not saying that necessarily happens in every instance, but we are monitoring it on our estate.
Great, fantastic. I think that's definitely a word of conclusion, I would say, is understanding the implication of what we do, and monitoring it is definitely a key path to achieving good measures on our historic buildings. So thank you very much. We've now run out of time, so I'm going to wrap up, and I would like to say thank you very much to all the attendees, and first to all the panels also. Duncan McCallum from Historic England, Victoria Herring from the Grosvenor Estate, Jane Henshaw from the Cadugan Estate, and Laura Jokers from Howard Walden. Thank you all for your great contribution and insight in your own experiences. Thank you to all the audiences. We've had more than 200 people listening in, so thank you very much. And if you have any further questions, do get in touch with the British Property Federation, and we will aim to help you further in your path to addressing your historic buildings. So there will be also recording made available of this webinar on the British Property Federation's YouTube channel in due course. So do have a look at the link. Thank you again for attending, and wishing everyone a very good day. Thank you.